Welcome everyone to the 2021 ACTC Conference, Crisis and Consolation, Liberal Education in the Time of COVID. It is Friday morning after a long, rich week of conversation about core texts, about teaching, about making it through this pandemic as teachers and people who miss being together. It's been a wonderful week to reconnect with people. And we are in for a treat this morning. We have a very special plenary panel, an unusual one, in honor of Scott Lee and his book, Invention, the Art of Liberal Arts. And we sort of have the luxury of the whole morning together. We're going to give it a little bit of structure, but mainly we have all morning to talk about this wonderful book and give Scott a chance to answer some of our questions about it. A few of you have prepared remarks and several others have prepared questions. So I think this will be our structure unless there are objections. We'll start with Martha and with Paige giving their remarks, and after each, we'll give Scott an opportunity to respond. So Martha first, and then Scott has an opportunity to respond, and Paige and Scott has an opportunity to respond, and then we'll open it up for questions, both to Scott and also to Paige and Martha about their remarks, and just to have it be a conversation. And we can, at that point, we can go to impromptu questions or to prepared questions. Kind of, I think I'm going to mainly leave that up to those of you who've prepared questions to decide when a good moment is for you to bring those in. We will take a break at 10:30. And reconvene at 10:45. You don't need to close out your browser. We'll just, turn off the cameras and microphones and walk away for a few minutes, take a break. And when we reconvene at 10:45, Emma Cohen-Delara will give some remarks, and Scott will have an opportunity to respond. And then the rest of the morning, after Emma's presentation and Scott's response, will be open for questions, whether you're one of those who have prepared questions or whether one has emerged for you that you'd like to ask in an impromptu way. So how does that sound to everybody? Does that sound all right? Okay, fantastic. Well then, Martha Franks, I guess I should say it is helpful, everybody knows this, I think, but it is helpful to keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. And if you decide to ask a question, it's nice for you to turn your camera on in those moments, even though it's fine to turn your camera off when you're just listening. So sorry about that, Martha. Sorry for that stutter step, but it's my pleasure to hand things over to you.
Hello, my name is Martha Franks. I'm on faculty at St. John's College, and I've been working with Scott really from the beginning on this, well, not from his beginning, but when he first began thinking about publishing this book, we've been talking about the ideas in it, and I've enjoyed them for a long time. So it was a pleasure to be to sit down and do a sort of formal response. And what I prepared focuses on the final chapter and a consideration of Scott's thoughts about Aristotle and the liberal arts. Scott's book, Invention, the Art of the Liberal Arts, both states and exemplifies how those of us who experience the liberal arts as the heart of being human can offer that experience feelingly. He exhorts us to be straightforward about why we pursue liberal arts. We do it because they give us the experience of freedom. When, instead of saying this, we make cost-benefit arguments about the usefulness of the liberal arts, everyone can tell we are not giving our real reasons. This is so even when the cost-benefit arguments are perfectly true. Those holding the purse strings as they listen to us making these sophistical arguments suspect, perhaps rightly, that we're simply trying to get them to pay for us to have fun. or for our students to have fun. I want to argue here, however, the particular kind of fun that the liberal arts provides is what Scott calls joy, and it is a serious matter. In chapter 10 of his book, Scott gives us an accounting based on Aristotle's Poetics of how it is that human beings experience freedom through the liberal arts. I expect him to correct me if I've gotten it wrong, but I wanted to dwell on what seems a little paradoxical in that accounting, a tension that sounds to me like the setup of a good joke, like the wonderful surprise of wit coming to the rescue of puzzlement. This made me wonder if the feeling of joy that we get from invention is related to its demonstrated power to turn dark places of non-understanding into places of unexpected possibility. If so, the liberal arts, as Scott understands them, are a means to comedy, not actually in Aristotle's use of the word comedy, but in the cosmic sense of comedy by which Dante's work is called a comedy. Invention and the companion act of making, even the making of an Aristotelian tragedy, is the comic twist that triumphs over our frequent human experience of randomness and disconnection. The seeming paradox that struck me in reading Scott's analysis of the Poetics is the juxtaposition of imitation with possibility. Aristotle argues that art is not like nature in the realm of necessity, but instead enters the realm of possibility. Human beings can take what nature produces by necessity and through art invent possibilities beyond what nature can do. That realm of possibility is vast, boundless, allowing even for impossibility and error if they serve to make the poetry more astounding. What is at first surprising is that the path to the realm of new invented possibility is imitation. All the forms of art, Aristotle says, are imitation. Human beings are the most imitative creatures in the world. Imitation, however, this comes from a lot of my students, it sounds like copying things, which seems like the opposite of inventing new possibilities. For Aristotle, it appears, the artist does not set out directly to make something new. Rather, the artist sets out to imitate and discovers possibilities incidentally. How do these discoveries arise out of such efforts to imitate? Aristotle tells us that all humans delight in representation as a kind of learning. As usual, he doesn't say nearly enough about exactly what he means by that. But here's one possibility. Perhaps he means that seeing a representation, a painting or a sculpture or a character on stage, is itself an image of the way that the mind can stand outside the world, the way we separate ourselves from experience in order to observe and articulate it. If this is so, then when we sit in an audience in a theater and watch a play, we are, so to speak, abstracting ourselves. That act of abstraction, of standing outside of an object of our understanding, is what it feels like to learn. So the act of imitating, even when it tries to be perfectly faithful to the world, still forces a separation that, incidentally, allows us to see things new. Here's another possibility that points in a contrary direction. Aristotle talks about the emotions of pity and fear that are awakened in us by the best tragic drama. These feelings, especially pity, imply not separation or abstraction, but deep involvement, even identification with the characters on stage. From this point of view, the learning that we enjoy might come from the privilege of vicarious experience. It is as if we are given the chance to live more lives than one. Both of these possibilities can be understood as experiences of freedom. The abstraction of ourselves from the world presented on stage is connected to the freedom from the bewildering randomness of our sublunar day-to-day lives that we feel when we reach for the universals. The touching of orderly eternity that philosophy gives us is a very great freedom. The freedom attached to vicarious experience allows us to leave our own lives behind for a few hours and enter other lives, to return after the catharsis of pity and fear. Perhaps, even though abstraction seems like the opposite of emotional involvement, they both can be said to free us from the limitations of our small selves. Returning to Scott's arguments for how to defend the liberal arts, I want to consider Aristotle's claim that we delight in learning, which I take to be the same thing that Scott means when he talks about joy. I suggest that the joy, the delight, come from the essentially comic nature of the understanding of the arts in the liberal arts that Scott, channeling Aristotle, gives. The human capacity for invention is comic in that, because of it, we make coherence out of what is before us, however random and incomprehensible it appears. Even if what is before us actually is random and incomprehensible, whatever actually might mean, our human capacity for invention makes coherence from it, creating a future. This cosmic type of comedy is what we teach when we show our students, in the hope that they will imitate it, the great moments of invention in the human past, from which the future we now inhabit as the present was invented. I can't talk even about cosmic comedy without telling a joke. This is an internet meme that's been kicking around lately, so maybe some of you have heard it. It seems that Jacques Derrida was giving a lecture in English to an American audience. For an hour, he spoke about, of all topics, cows. Students respectfully took notes, perhaps glancing furtively around to see if anyone else understood why the distinguished professor was talking about cows. The lecture ended and Derrida left the room while perplexed students gathered up their books. Then Derrida came back, stood at the podium and announced, "I'm told the word is pronounced chaos." I like this joke because I had all sorts of abstract opinions about Derrida and also identified with the students trying to understand. Then with the punchline, I learned something about my own prejudices. The comic twist made sense of what had seemed random. A way of understanding that I had not thought of caused in me a little burst of delight and laughter, a joy at what might be called a new possibility, even an invention about the situation. That mixture of abstraction and identification, both of which are learning, when offered something unexpected, an invention, brings us to that burst, a catharsis perhaps. Aristotle, discussing tragedy, talks about a catharsis of pity and fear, which has a sense of purging as if he wanted them to go. But the insight Scott offers may broaden this. If the liberal arts, because of their rootedness in possibility, have power to invent new possibility even when confronted with meaninglessness, then the practice of invention, you might say, may result in a catharsis of empathy and hope. That feels like joy. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. That's great. Scott, the floor is yours.
Okay, a couple preliminaries as I get towards my thanks to Martha in particular. First off, Charlie, thanks for this panel and creating the time and space for it. Thanks for the idea of opening it up to so many people who could participate in it as a matter of, thought and questions and so forth. The second thing is, I owe a debt of gratitude to Phil LaCour and to Martha Franks for helping to produce this book. There would be no panel without this book, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful to them. They had an earlier idea for a panel like this a year ago, and it, of course, we all know what COVID did to that. So I guess in some ways, we can say that it's an ill wind that blows nobody good. And there have been a lot of terrible losses through COVID, but perhaps with time, we found that we could have a much more fulsome discussion. And that leads me to a thing that we wrote just as the book was coming out. It was the affirmation. It's the first thing I think you open up to after the table of contents. And it was about the strength of the liberal arts in the face of COVID, and about about our need for the liberal arts and joy, if you wish, as we go into the future, despite the horrible losses that this disaster has brought. So I hope that people feel as if this book may in its parts reaffirm our commitment to the liberal arts and perhaps be able to take us forward. Now, Martha's particular paper, I do want to invite, I think, especially in something like with Martha's paper, maybe I shouldn't be the only one commenting here. And so I'll make one or two brief remarks about it. I'm really delighted with her focus on the comic aspects of invention making and liberal arts altogether. I do believe that she's pretty much had an insight into a way to proceed forward. And I think what I'd like to do is almost in a hypothetical way return to the text of Aristotle for a minute on this, because I think it might help to speak in the way that Martha did to a more fulsome appreciation of what poetics, invention, and making might give to us. Aristotle, it is pretty much, there's an agreement that the treatise is a partial treatise. That is, that there was probably at least a second book on comedy and mock epic. I'm happy to go with Martha's formulation of the, I think it was the cosmic twist that made sense of what she hadn't thought of. I had my own formulation, but that what she's got there is that sense of the comedy can give us of something that's far more worthwhile than something we would take seriously to begin with. And but I do think I want to say something about the notion of catharsis right at the end that she's introducing. I think an argument can be made that the poetics isn't, especially if it had two books, but moreover, because of that argument that starts from the very beginning of sentence, comedy, tragedy, lyric, others are named, happen to be imitations. Well, that happens to be is that sense of possibility. And from then on, the question of possibility that making presents to humans runs through the entire book. And it includes an awful lot of development of what I would call positive freedoms that we wouldn't otherwise have if we didn't have the arts. That said, where you end up in the 25th chapter, and an argument might be made that 25th and 26th can be reversed, but we won't worry about that. What you end up with is a lot of different arts and sciences criticizing artists, and really Aristotle making an argument that poetry stands on its own grounds, and that the proper and appropriate way to approach poetry is to ask what has been made, what has been achieved, what has been accomplished, how well was this done, what are its functions, all those kinds of questions that we could apply to our books. And I learned an awful lot from this about our own books in thinking about just this discussion of poetry. So it was really, in my view at least, an expression, the first expression of freedom long before we had any concept of rights in the West. Freedom, what we now call freedom of expression or something like that. One kind of length of the argument is this argument about possibility, which is tied to a joy in learning. But we can express that if we take Martha's point of view and we pretend that maybe there might have been a book on comedy, we might get to the end. And here I would have a little bit of a disagreement with Martha. I don't think that we want to so much purge joy or something like this. What we want to have is that experience of joy through some kind of cosmic twist that Martha was talking about. And so I think the second book might have carried over out of that to what I would talk about as as a kind of an enthusiasm for hope and sympathy that comes through making. And that's why you would invent, because you have hope for the future, because you have a sympathy and an empathy for people you live with, that vicarious experience. And I might add, I will go further because Martha's right. You have a hope and a sympathy for something that you might never have actually experienced yourself. So there's a huge broadening that happens in light of invention and through a joy of learning. And I'll just leave it at that for further thought.
I think we should go ahead and get Paige's presentation on the table, if that's okay, and then we'll have time to open it up after, just to make sure we get through this. So Paige, please.
Okay. Good morning, everybody from Norfolk, Virginia. So pleased and proud to be here. My background is in comparative literature, but I was mostly busy with honors education at Norfolk State University. And my colleague, Michelle Rosca, is here this morning, and I thank her for participating in our conference. And I'm happy to read to you a much more pedestrian work than what Martha gave us. This is a pretty conventional review of the book that I hope will be at least a little bit helpful for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read it, as in what's in the book. So I hope it will at least contribute that little bit, though it doesn't lead us into the ethereal spaces that Martha did already, and Scott. At any rate, this review was published in the 2020 issue of Journal of General Education. There it is. There it is. And so I speak a bit to the issue of Gen Ed and liberal arts. So, people who inhabit the spacious Venn diagram intersection between proponents of the liberal arts and those of general education form a, quote, community, unquote. A word simply but elegantly defined by Bruce Kimball and quoted by J. Scott Lee in his new book, Invention, The Art of Liberal Arts, as, quote, a group of people who talk to each other and do it well, unquote, which is a pretty good definition of ACTC too, if you ask me. But lately, this beloved community has suffered change and challenges comparable to prisoners stuck in some platonic COVID cave. But hearken now to a messenger from the realm of light who has spent his whole career shuttling up and down and adjusting his vision between a brilliant ideascape and darkened subterranean conditions. The aforementioned Lee, University of Chicago trained in great books and more, is the former executive director of the Association for Core Texts and Courses, whom I first encountered when I was a lucky participant in a 3 summers long NEH grant entitled Bridging the Gap Between Science and the Humanities. And to complete my disclosure, I now serve on the ACTC Board of Trustees. While consisting of talks and republished essays, pitched both at scholars and an interested general public, Lee's book also serves as a memoir of his impressive worldwide diplomacy. He has been a tireless paladin for the cause of teaching core texts, an educational practice too often dismissed as elitist or even racist. While the preponderance of the core texts discussed by Lee and others admittedly have been written by dead white men, the conservative rep of Lee's paideia is still undeserved. There are no canon police at an ACTC gathering. Have you seen any canon police? No, you haven't. And Lee militates in his book for inclusion of American texts of all genres and eras, written by all races, plus world literature writ equally large and broad. In a particularly useful appendix to the book entitled The Concept of Core Texts, a synopsis, Lee points out three sources for core texts. First, they are the texts, including artifacts that descend from ancient to modern times, recognized as significant human achievements, unquote. Second, they are classics as determined by world cultures themselves and made available worldwide to augment the, quote, ancient uniting of Greco-Roman and Hebrew Aramaic texts into one tradition of reading as exemplified by Augustine, unquote. He continues, Scott continues, quote, equally likely, however, is that a third tradition of core texts, that of educational institutions, may provide a rich pluralism of future canons, unquote. Though Lee's history of faculty-devised institutional canons gives medieval, Renaissance, and 19th century Oxbridgian examples, there is no reason that this category should not also be liberally construed to include a canon extra rich in African-American classics at, say, an HBCU, such as the reviewer's own home, Norfolk State University, where core texts are encouraged in honors courses, though admittedly not always chosen. In another progressive, even radical move in his book, Lee repeatedly enthuses about performing arts texts, especially theater, and visual arts texts, especially painting. And moreover, he encourages students not only to learn from the greats, but also to invent their own works of art that others might someday likewise tout as core. The book's titular words, art and invention, serve as lively leitmotifs, as in the following. And here's a brief quote. In other words, invention is the characteristic response in the liberal arts to the project of continuing the quest for knowledge. In our context, invention provided the bridge between old and new knowledge, while it simultaneously constructed both the distinction between past and future, as well as the distinction between the science and the humanities. Lee is by no means dismissing scientists as uninventive. He is an avid promoter of scientific core texts. It is just that the sciences proceed, as he defines them, by hypothesis rather than invention. But note that the liberal arts and humanities do seem more truly Janus-based, inventing a future by constructing the past. A closer look at the book's prefatory material, acknowledging the pandemic exacerbated crisis in higher ed, and its table of contents will begin to convey the breadth of Lee's critical acumen, coupled with a mastery of statistics and reporting that made him such a formidable grantsman and administrator. Lee dedicates the volume to his mentor and partner in founding the ACTC, Dr. Bruce Kimball, and there is a helpful, pithy foreword by Dr. Patrick Malcolmson, Professor Emeritus at St. Thomas University in Canada. Section 1 of the volume explores invention, possibilities, and student capacities, with Chapter 1 on Lee's theory of invention, and Chapter 2, a skilled practicum to core text analysis using Leon Alberti's essay on painting to illuminate Botticelli's Uffizi Adoration. The 1475 painting concomitantly receives an elegant close reading by Lee himself. With chapter 3, Lee takes on the faculty and students who resist the core text concept, bringing in the philosophical argument between John Dewey and Robert Maynard Hutchins in 1936, as further mediated by Louis Menon in 1997. Lee also introduces a Platonic phrasing he relishes, the argumentative joint. Maybe we can come back to that. That is the spot where dialectical reasoning opens itself up to flexing or further thoughtful intervention. Section 2 of the volume, entitled Making Liberal Arts Education, begins with chapter 4, History and Imagination in the Core, the achievement of the Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. This chapter combines exempla from the Catholic core tradition at Thomas More, for instance, from Augustine's Confessions, but alludes as well to Shaw's Pygmalion with its instances of self-discovery and emancipation through education. The next full chapter reintroduces Doolittle and Higgins for a more leisurely, romping, close reading of the play by Lee. Chapter 6 offers some of the author's several visits to universities in Colombia and Taiwan, the People's Republic, and especially Europe, and I see that Emma has joined us, have also shown interest in the power of liberal arts teaching. The core texts mentioned in this chapter, the Torah, the Bible, the Phaedrus, the Analects, and Don Quixote, get cursory but useful commentary. Chapter 7 is another musing on invention, innovation, and techne, another of Lee's master terms. Section 3 of the volume, Curricula as Objects of Art, gives 2 chapters, 8 and 9, focused on faculty accomplishments in core curriculum design. Chapter 9, Aeneas's Shield and Arts of the Future, offers Lee's critical prowess again on display as he examines the shield as an objet d'art that Virgil places on a beam, as in the French term mise en abîme, to encapsulate the thrust of the entire epic. Section 4 supplies what Lee calls a poetic coda, or the ultimate argument for the liberal arts. Far from insisting that core texts should be consumed because they are the super texts of literature, as kale is sometimes bitter tasting superfood, Lee analyzes Aristotle's Poetics to emphasize the, quote, loving joy in inventive learning for its own sake, shared by a community that takes freedom and invention as its greatest good. And that's sort of where Martha was focusing. The emphasis is more on the joy than on the salutary effects. There follow appendices in the hard copy volume with additional material posted on the respondio.com website. And I see Phil is over there. Scott Lee has long served, in his own words, as a, quote, an executive producer of liberal arts projects. And there are moments in the book when his energy and erudition almost overwhelm, perhaps in the manner of Cecil B. DeMille. It is sometimes tough to wade through Lee's Red Sea of exempla, including copious, often lengthy content footnotes that sometimes threaten to swamp the main text. But like passengers clambering aboard a lifeboat, all these notes do deserve a place, and I would be loath to sacrifice any. Lee's is a voice that should be heard from the depths of our collective cave to the highest heights inhabited by our public and university officials. As he says, quote, a crisis is really an opportunity for humane education, unquote. It is way past time to rescue, reconceive, and rebuild liberal arts curricula and the general education curricula they so importantly intersect. And for goodness sake, let us build that back even better. Thank you.
Thanks, Paige. The Cecil B. DeMille image is gonna stick with me, I'm sure, among other things. Scott, over to you. You're muted. Oh, there you go.
Um, uh, really, Paige, and I mean, I mean this most sincerely. What a fulsome and friendly review. Nobody could ask for anything better than that. It's just, uh, and I think you did a terrific job of bringing out what at least I hope I tried to convey through the book and through the experience I had with all, primarily with ACTC, with all my colleagues. And you were one of the first I had such experiences with. So I'm deeply, deeply touched by it, as you know. I think there's so many things you could pick out from what Paige said, but I think the one thing I do want to go to, she may have a different wish, and most welcome to follow up. But I want to speak to the pluralism of liberal arts education. This is part of that, her discussion of the appendix and how canons are established. And it might be useful for next year's conference to consider the pluralism of our institutions and therefore the pluralism of our canons. It is true that, as the film line goes, many of our programs have the usual suspects, but a much wider view, a view where you really do start taking into account, as so often happens in an ACTC presentation, of the texts that are in the syllabus, and then you start thinking about the texts that you share, and then the texts that aren't there. That leads to question in your program. I mean, they're there in another program, but they're not there in your program. That leads to the real questions of beyond tactics and what shall we say, departmental satisfactions of what texts are doing in a curriculum, and therefore what the texts are aiming at. And I think the pluralism of our organization, as opposed to the relatively narrow ecology of most disciplines, relatively. I mean, this can be argued, but the relatively narrow ecology of most disciplines, I think, is a huge strength for liberal arts education. And I think it can be emphasized probably publicly in a way that we haven't been taking advantage of yet and should look to in the future. So I really want to also emphasize that this is a very good reason among many, but it's a really important reason and a way in which we can resist the collapse of institutions into each other or their utter complete and utter disappearance. We want to think about that opportunity, that breadth, and we can talk about this a bit more, but the opportunity and breadth that these texts present. And they are, by the way, texts that people can, not just faculty members, but students can choose, in the sense that their interests are evoked by them and they pursue them further to, in my view, their own inventions. Paige, there's many things that we could say about this, and there are other things that could be picked up by other people. But I want to thank you for that generous review, and for particularly kind of beginning with that cortex, that appendix, which is an appendix to the argument, but in some way represents the underlying material, which helps to make the argument of the book possible.
Thank you, Scott.
I think now, probably because we have such a great group here today, I can't fit all of you on the screen. It's probably worthwhile for you to use the hand raising function, which you should be able to find either under reactions or participants at the bottom of the page. I see Phil's already got that. So what Phil's done is raised his hand, and anyone else who would like to ask a question. And I think it's okay if these are questions that have just come to you, or you're one of the people who've prepared questions and given Scott some a little bit advance notice. Either one. This is open to both sorts of questions. So we've got Phil and then Matt. Phil, please.
Good morning, everybody. I will try to speak up since I tend to be a mumbler, but I will try to speak clearly. And as it turns out, I'm sitting in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I do want to open I'm going to pose a question to Scott. I'm going to make a proposal and ask him for his reflections on that proposal, a proposal based on his book. But I did want to comment on what you see behind me as opposed to what I see behind you. What I see behind you, in many cases, are shelves full of beautiful books that already exist. And what you see behind me are shelves of books that don't yet exist, but will as soon as we can get them published. It's a working shelves for our publishing venture. So that I hope that explains a little bit what might look like a desolate landscape or a desolate bookshelf behind me. Just a word about myself in the sense that it will provide a context for the question I want to pose to Scott. My involvement with ACTC is not as long-standing as many of you. It only goes back 5 or 6 years, and the first conference that I attended with my wife was in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and I came to that conference to give a paper. I think it was on Apollonius, of all things. Apollonius's reconceptualization of Euclidean space. But at that conference, Scott Lee, through the good offices of my friend Rick Camber, who really brought me to ACTC, Scott Lee had made arrangements for there to be a staged reading of a performance piece that I had written. This one involving Sandra Day O'Connor and Timothy McVeigh. And so there was a staged reading of a couple scenes from that performance piece, and I want to, in that context, remember Paige Laws, who courageously took up one of the parts that was quite controversial and that I think others were hesitant to perform. But she did a beautiful job, and that's how I got involved with ACTC. My involvement with liberal education goes back considerably further than that. I've been a faculty member at St. John's College now almost 50 years, and starting in 1972. Just one last word about this little publishing venture that we have. It's called Respondeo Books, and Respondeo comes from Thomas Aquinas. After he has heard what other people have to say about a given question, he starts his own resolution and own thoughts with the word respondeo, I respond. And it's a word that conveys both responsiveness, but also responsibility. So that's why it's called Respondeo Books. And I encourage you to go to the website, www.respondeobooks.com. So I will get on with the question that I want to pose to Scott with that bit of an introduction. And the prologue to that question is a remark that I heard Nigel Tubbs make in the session on the European initiative. Nigel Tubbs over there in England said that in his experience, the terms core text and liberal arts did not resonate with people, that he said they didn't seem to have the same cachet there that he thinks they might have in America. And then a couple days later in the session on the Asian organizations, Christine Henderson said something very similar. She said the phrase liberal arts really doesn't work in Singapore. I forget the exact word that she used, but it wasn't dicey, but it was similar to the word dicey. She said the language just doesn't have any traction there. And I want to put one last little prologue to the question in the form of a personal anecdote. Many years ago, in fact, in the early 1970s, after I had started as a young tutor at St. John's College here in Santa Fe, after a couple of years, my parents drove down from Colorado to visit me here. It looked like I might be staying for a while, and I think they were wondering what it was all about. And so I gave them a tour of the campus, and we went into the seminar rooms, and I showed them how the tables were shaped with a place at either end for the two tutors so that there would be a non-authoritarian rhetoric to the actual physical setup, and everybody could see everybody else's face. And then I took them into the junior laboratory to explain what we do in the lab. And on the bench, there was this contraption, I guess I would call it, about 5 feet tall. And it had cranks and belts and big round glass plates and wires and brushes. And my father, who had studied chemistry in college, asked me, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, that's a Windsurst machine." And he said, "Well, what's a Windsurst machine?" And I explained that it was a machine for developing charges of static electricity. And he asked me how it worked. And I found that I couldn't explain why it worked, but I could turn the crank and show him that it worked. So I did. I cranked up a fairly impressive charge of static electricity, which I then discharged in a little display of lightning right there in the lab. And I thought that I had responded to his question. So we walked out of the lab, and we were standing on the stairs overlooking the pond in the center of the campus and the lower campus. And with more kindness in his voice than is possible to imagine, my father turned to me and said, "Phil, would you ever consider applying for a job in a real college?" And I have thought about that question many times as to what was it that I was unable to communicate to my own parents, who meant only well toward me, about what I have spent my life doing. With that as a prologue, and I might say I want to fold into that remarks that I heard Stuart Patterson make from the Scheimer panel the other day about the situation that he and his colleagues are in. I want to propose that we take two phrases that are our main currency in ACTC, namely core text and liberal arts, and make one phrase out of them. To take the word core from the phrase core text as I think by far the stronger word, and to take the word arts at Scott's suggestion from the phrase liberal arts, and to start to understand ourselves and to present ourselves to others as those who teach the core arts This is a very small change in language, but I think it's a very large conceptual change. Small changes can be that way sometimes. I would suggest as an analogy the change politically from these United States before the Civil War to the United States after the Civil War. It's a very small change, but it's a very large change. The phrases core text and liberal arts, I think, have a sense of apology about them, similar to beloved old furniture that you describe to others who may be in your home as heirlooms. There's a sense of needing to explain why you have such things. Also, in some circles, I think the phrase liberal arts anymore has an air of what I would call intellectual fuddy-duddiness about it. There are so many more sharp-edged, aggressive, modern intellectual initiatives like artificial intelligence and genetic editing and that sort of thing. And that liberal arts seems to be, have a little bit of dust on it. And there's also a sense of, in the language of liberal arts and core text, I think, a quiet plea to be allowed to exist in the context of institutions that have more serious business at hand, business like research and promoting the economy and that sort of thing. I think the phrase core arts as a successor to liberal arts and core text does not have this apologetic sense about it. I think that it is a direct assertion of relevance that requires a response from those who presently occupy institutional territory. As a closing remark on this proposal, I did want to reference something that I heard Joe Knippenberg say on the first day of this conference, which I was very struck by, which is in his sense of liberal education, he used the phrase proposing obstacles of thought in the path of action. And on that same day, Josh Perrins, I thought, if I could slightly paraphrase what I heard him say, was proposing obstacles of action in the path of thoughts that might need to be interrupted because of their prejudicial inertia. I think that the phrase core arts, if we could reconceive of ourselves in this way and present ourselves to other people in this way, spans the distance between Joe Knippenberg's formulation and Scott Perrin's formulation. What are those arts? They're the same arts, the arts of thinking and the arts of acting. They are the same arts of speaking clearly, thinking coherently, and speaking persuasively. So Scott, that's my little question to you, and I would like to ask you what you think about it.
I think it's a good invention. And I think and I mean that seriously, of course. And I think you've laid out a pretty good reason why a discussion of it could be taken up. Whether it needs to substitute for cortex or whether it needs to substitute for liberal arts is another issue entirely. Rather, we might think about it as being evocative and invoking, okay, in both cases. And I think that's the power of your idea here. I do think that there are some things that just by nature, I've got some notes on what you said here. By nature of argument and by nature of thought, I would probably add to or want to make sure we thought about in those discussions. And then I think I want to talk a little bit about the significance or the experience of arts. And maybe the way I'll do that is to talk a little bit about the chapter on the Aeneid, which precedes the one on the poetics. Okay, so in my view, if we talk about core arts, again, this needs to be thought of as institutionally. I would take the core arts in its widest sense at St. John's to include the arts and sciences, philosophy and literature, history, and so forth. In more narrow programs, the core arts would probably be restricted to an emphasis that it's possible for the institution to make. So I think if you have a core arts idea, you want to make sure that it's understood pluralistically. The second thing is, I think you also want to understand that, of course, these aren't, not only might there be limitations, but there might be differences in how the arts are formulated and thought about. And our entire corpus of philosophy and artistic achievement and argument about the sciences and about politics in the cortex realm would indicate that there'd be a lot of pluralism about what constitutes art and what they are. I have no problem with any of this. I think centering them on arts of thinking and acting is good, but also arts of making. That's very much how we engage. We're making. We are conversing, but we're making this conversation too, and it will be recorded. So another thing I think, I think your remark about the dust on liberal arts is somewhat appropriate, but at the same time, that's why I thought it was important for ACTC to re-engage with and to speak about rejuvenating and renewing the liberal arts. This is a techne, we can get into this more as we go on, but this is a techne that we need to recapture, and we simply haven't done it. So there's this engagement with arts of that are produced, and there's an engagement with arts of universal arts of thought. I think you're right on both of those, but I do think it's important to outline in part, and I think this is only in part, sort of different ways of thinking about what the arts do to us, and conversely, what we do to the arts. And I think that the Aeneid is pretty exemplary of this, because the arts are completely and totally central in the Aeneid to the action of the epic. And I think that in large part, the action of the epic is an education of a hero. And that education doesn't pull the arts out, and it doesn't happen. It can't happen. So I've thought about this, and I think there are a number of arts there. We may or may not know a number of effects and uses within the epic, which can be paraded out in a kind of a narrative manner, right? And I can indicate where I think these appear, but I think they're worth thinking about. It's obviously our arts of war, and actually that I'm not going to go into at all. The arts of war are, in fact, I think, governed in the Aeneid by other arts, and so we can get to that if we want. I think there's a stage of consolation. Arts as consolation for the past, consolation for injury and suffering. All of this shows up, for example, when Aeneas is in front of the wall of Carthage. I think there's arts of sympathy or empathy, and that shows up in his narration to Dido, and how Dido, in the particular situation in which she is in, not only falls in love with him, but understands totally and completely what he's gone through because of her own experience. And this is somewhat different than an art of consolation. I also think there's arts can be a consummate destruction of the spirit. And I think we ought to face that and talk about it. And of course, Dido is the prime example with her funeral pyre, which is a structure of artifacts which are meant to signal, to indicate how she has been crushed by the weight of Aeneas's departure. And literally it's signal and it's symbolic. We can talk more about that. So arts can crush the spirit, but they can also buoy it. And I think that's indicated in the way Aeneas comes to Carthage, and he looks at all the buildings and his spirit is lifted after the utter destruction of his home. That's enormous, absolutely enormous. There's artlessness. This is exemplified by when, for example, Mercury. I mean, it's almost a comic. It's almost a comic moment in the Aeneid. Mercury, Jupiter has been speaking to Venus about how his mother did not give birth to Aeneas so that he could just reside in Carthage, that he has a much larger future, a huge future ahead of him for peoples and for establishing a new Troy anew. What happens instead is that Mercury goes and says, basically, if you don't get moving, you're going to be hit by lightning. I mean, that's almost that's the reduction of Jupiter's message. And sure, it gets Aeneas off the dime, but it is an incredible example of artlessness, the absence of the very kinds of arts of thought and of thoughtful speech that you're talking about. I think also there are, and this is the most important thing, and we can go into it if you want, but there are arts of prophecy. Part of that is Jupiter predicting what the future will be, and that part of the art of prophecy has it's legislation, it's rule, and the problem with that is that you have to have human agents that, and in this case, divine agents that accomplish it. You can legislate all you want, but it has to, people don't just get up and march. They have character and they make judgments and they have passions through which rule comes about, if you wish. So there's this sort of prediction of the future that is really legislative. And then I think there's another kind of artful prophecy, and that's education, which is most evidenced in the fields of Elysium or but even more so on the shield of Aeneas. And the shield of Aeneas is distinctive from all the other indicators that we've had because it has no obvious reference. It does to readers outside, but not to Aeneas. When he looks at it, however, he's glad, he's hopeful, the kind of joy we were talking about. And the reason why he's glad and hopeful, though he knows nothing about any of the images on the shield, is that basically this is a diploma. He's going into the future in an enterprise beyond his ken, and he knows it. And that's what education, in our kind of education, can give to people. So I think the idea, if this is a reasonable idea about core arts, I think, or has some attachment to core arts, which I think it does, it might be a good reason for using the phrase.
All right, Matt, I think you're up next.
All right, thank you. Let's see, just lower my hand. Yeah, by the way, I'll just take this moment to say it's a great privilege to be here. Thank you very much, and thank the panelists and also Scott for your very excellent book. I have a fairly simple question, which is, to Scott, how do you understand the end, telos, or final cause of poetic activity? However, if I may, I just want, Scott actually does offer answers to this question in chapter 10. And if I may, I'd like to just very briefly go over a couple of things he says in chapter 10 and just note one or two places where I would certainly appreciate him going deeper, because of course he doesn't have time to go into everything in the chapter. And as many of you may know, he of course draws a distinction between nature and art. Nature being concerned with what is and necessity, and art concerned with the possible and freedom. And he places a great emphasis on novelty, or bringing something new into the world. And in this spirit, by the way, and for those of you who may have the book right in front of you, I may just give you page numbers if you want. So on page 231, he talks about the importance of artistic completion, right? And he connects it to imitation. Then a little bit later on page 237, and I'm just going to quote this. This is from the second paragraph. The place of learning in imitation, or what is the same, the appearance of the final cause of both tragedy and comedy. Which I find a very interesting phrase, the place of learning in imitation, or the final cause of both tragedy and comedy. And as Socrates is wont to say, sometimes I feel like it's phrased in the form of an oracle. And that's one thing in particular, Scott. I'll have a few more comments, but that's one thing in particular I would be grateful for some clarification about. Moving on a little bit, on page 251, and here he's commenting actually on Aristotle's Topics. He talks about bringing coherence and characterizing freedom, not as a political end, but as an epistemic end of learning. And again, I find that very, very suggestive, but I don't know what it means. So if that's something you could comment a little bit on. And then I promise I'm going to wrap up the, the points of which I have questions here. Well, actually getting into something I think that's a little clearer and helpful. Page 252, it's the last paragraph. He talks about a curriculum where the faculty and students are formally encouraged to explore relations by developing a conversation, employing dialectic, and this is what freedom in the liberal arts is. So that's helpful, right? And I think we all have a concrete experience of this, of freedom through conversation. And then final quotation, and this is on page 256, and I treat it as a bit of a culmination of a lot of what he said before this. Thus, a liberal arts dialogue would synthesize three functions aimed at freedom or the joy of learning. Now, he actually has mentioned this several times in the chapter, but I didn't go to those passages because this passage very nicely sums it up, I think. So freedom and joy of learning. Meeting and making arguments or imitations on their own grounds. Conducting inquiries into the relations and foundations of what we know. And forming judgments for the future. All of which would be in the service of learning the joys of human invention. Okay, so just a final thought on this. So it's clear that Scott is bringing together a lot of things, right? The artistic versus the natural, freedom, and I think he identifies the specifically human element here in freedom. But the question that really emerges for me in this is that from honestly a bit of a thick-skulled way of approaching it, you would say, well, look, I can take joy in learning something which as I learn it, I think has always been so. And maybe there is a novelty in it because I'm learning it for the first time, or I articulate that learning for the first time, or I learn it in a way because of a conversation which has never occurred before, right? This is a unique conversation between me and the interlocutors of the students. So that's one way of combining the new with learning. Another way of combining it is to say, through art, something truly new has come into the world. This work of art is something that has never been seen before, or something that Scott likes to, as discussed before, you know, the invention of perspective in painting, right? So you have a moment where something truly new comes into the world, and in that moment, I learn something about a possibility, or maybe I learn about something that just wouldn't have existed if this had never occurred. And I can take joy in that. that seems to be a different way in which novelty and joy of learning come together. So I've described two different ways that could come together. But in saying this, I'm just kind of taking a stab here and guessing that this is what Scott means. And maybe Scott would be pleased with this and say, exactly, Matt, invent away. I'm encouraging you to invent away. But that said, I'd very much like to know what you think about it. And thinking about some of the earlier passage I quoted where I have some confusions. And if you could just elaborate a little bit more fully on how you understand that end final cause or telos of the poetic activity. So I hope that was relatively clear. My apologies if it wasn't. Thank you again, Scott.
Hey, Matt, thank you. Let's see. I think the poetics has a large component devoted to hubris, doesn't it? So I go through this list of things that I said, and I apologize for any hubris there at all. Yeah, actually, I do think you got it. I do.
Thanks.
No, I'm serious. And this is what I would try to urge, actually, our programs to develop more fully, because I don't think they do. Yes, they're very good at conversation articulation, and there are whole realms of laying the groundwork for happiness, possibly becoming more democratic, taking the human spirit and letting it fly. And I think all that is true in the conversations that we have. I don't take anything away from it. And I think quite frankly, it does rest on a joy in learning. However, there is, and you can fairly say in a transitory way, but not without building our capacities. And I'll get to that in a second. You can say that there are lasting effects, so to speak, in this joy of learning and learning to articulate and enjoy the spirit. And I think much of that, by the way, I think a fair amount of that appeared in some of Bill McClay's remarks yesterday. That said, there is a further joy in learning about yourself, your community, and the arts that you're actually acquiring when you commit yourself as a student or a professor or a tutor to engage in making something that is a response to these marvelous texts that we have. Now, the traditional response is the essay, which is kind of a paper version of the conversation. I know that could be disputed, but it's certainly like the scholarship that goes on in the humanities that ultimately and finally, I think, unfortunately, disappears into a library. Relatively unread, I might add. Plenty of statistics on this. But if what we start asking our students to do is to make a lab experiment, make a field observation, make a musical or stage performance, make an exhibit, make a webcast, make a journal, like, for example, as seen earlier in the discussion of transformative texts. To me, that was capstone stuff, and I don't mean the end at the fourth year. I mean capstone of a course. Those students produced a contest in which they began to elaborate, because they had read these books. They began to elaborate in ways that they never would have in their conversation. So they were inventing. They were going forward because they were bringing something into the world that didn't exist. And yes, they were learning, sure, about what it takes to make an essay that's going to be public, not just read by the teacher. It's really going to be public. But they were learning something about the relationship between themselves, that book, and this product that they were producing. Now, what that learning will be will vary from person to person, but that it is learned because they made a telos. That's the end. That seems to me pretty important. And it gives a freedom that cannot be achieved simply by articulation. It just simply can't be achieved by articulation. I'm not against articulation. It should be very obvious I'm not against it. But I do think there is a further step. So let's see. There's much that I'm trying, let me try to deal with much of what you brought out. By tying something a little bit about judgment to the epistemic end of learning, because I think it goes to what my response to your questions, and the coherence and freedom. Now, look, in thinking about this, number one, I have nothing, I've made it repeatedly clear over and over. I have nothing against our defenses or constructions of curricula that are aimed at political achievement. Okay, just I don't want to get into that controversy because, again, and I'm something of a pluralist, and it's perfectly obvious that inventions can serve politics, but it also, I think it's fairly obvious that many times what's happened is, and this is perfectly clear in questions of technology, what happens is politics responds to, societies build, become different because the arts and sciences have been freed to be able to achieve what they are going to achieve, and there's no predicting that by politics that I'm aware of, and we can have that discussion if we want to have it. So then what happens is, yeah, there is an epistemic aspect about this, and that's the substitute. That's the way you get to freedom without having to declare a political stance. And I think it's really important because also it offers an alternative to the political stance in the same way that Bill McClay was saying, well, let's go back to the Greeks and look at Plato's, let's look at Plato's criticisms of freedom so that we can think about our own democracy. Well, if you start looking at the possibilities of the arts and sciences, you start thinking about, that's going to be one of those consequences. You're going to be thinking about your democracy as well, but you're also going to be thinking about what you can go forward with. To me, and I hope this is true of many, many students, what they can do by going through all these core texts is they develop an enormous context for their own inventions. And then what they do is they pick an interest, and they're using their judgment, and we'll talk more about this. They're using their judgment to pick an interest that they pursue. I went on a trip around the world thanks to my college. It was a serious academic endeavor. Later on, when we were older and I went back to visit the college, and with the professor who took us around there, shepherded us around there, we were reflecting about the outcomes of the education. And what was convincing was that everybody was changed by that trip. Nobody came back the same, but nobody came back the same as somebody else. You know, they used their character and judgment and went on. And this is in the same way, I think, with these texts. They are profound, but they can be used to do the kind of making and learning that I think I'm talking about, that I hope I'm beginning to clarify for you. I can't answer all those points. I'd love to have a continuing conversation with you and others about them, but I thought I'd just pick that way of trying to answer you.
No, that's very helpful. And if I may, very brief follow-up, thinking about imitation, right? And we know that in a kind of, and again, this is a very pedestrian way of speaking, right? But one could say, well, either something is novel or it's derivative, and it's derivative when someone just imitates. But what's interesting in what you're saying is you're saying, no, when the work is of sufficient originality and greatness, you can actually almost like somehow capture that creative spark. And what you're imitating is the capacity to bring something new. And it could be the case that one could say, well, look, that is how that works is mysterious. But I'm not 100% sure how it works is mysterious. So I was wondering if you had more to say about that. What does it mean to be imitative and yet novel at the same time? And the freedom that one finds in that. Yeah, so.
I'll be very quick on this. And I do think the touchstone here is Aristotle's notion that nature really can't always bring into existence things. It brings into existence wood, but you take the wood and make a table. So the table is something that nature can't produce. And what you're doing is you're not just taking a piece of wood, oh, I've got a piece of wood, you're shaping it and forming it. And so what you have is a completion. That's and anybody who's tried to do anything, make anything, knows that this sense of completion is utterly central. I mean, incomplete or complete, it is impossible to thoughtfully escape. So finally, then, I would say, and this was an insight I had, I think I'm right about this, and I think it's true whether I'm right or not about Aristotle. I don't think Aristotle is arguing that beforehand, before tragedy and comedy appeared, the artists already had tragedy and comedy in mind. They had the experience of writing invectives and so forth, and they had the experience of epics. But dramatists came along and they started tinkering with this. And then, almost to their surprise, they produced tragedies. Now, from then on, you can have artists aiming at tragedies, and they'll be new. And Shakespeare does a completely different job, completely different than the ancients. Okay, so you can do a lot of different work with this, but there is this element of surprise as you discover the potentialities of the very art that you are working into, which would be the best way of saying it. So there's a kind of a telos here, but it's a discovered telos. And that, after all, is sort of something that I think is really important about looking at all our texts. Just cut them off, go backwards and cut them off. And none of those texts that you just cut off existed before. It's surprising that they come to exist later. That's the quick answer I can give to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is entirely unsurprising that even though we've given the entire morning to this topic, that I'm already beginning to fear we're not going to be able to fit everything in. So here's what I think we should do. We have about 6 minutes until the break. Mark, if you could ask a 6-minute or less version of your question, and if we need to continue that after the break, we will, or perhaps you can get through it and Scott can give his answer afterwards. And then we will start when we reconvene at 10:45. We will start with Emma's remarks, but then we'll go to Phil Sloan after that, and then open the floor back again. So Mark, it's to you.
Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon from London. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak on this, and congratulate you on the book, Scott. It's a tribute to your work, and I really appreciated reading it. Having read it, I'm a bit concerned, as is my nature, that the freedom you want to create hasn't been given so far in this discussion. The disciplined structure that I felt is coming out of the book, and I was surprised when on the discussion of core arts a few minutes ago. That you accepted that so readily, because I think that core arts might be, I would listen to it, but isn't that, a rhetorical solution to the grammatical problem at the heart of liberal arts? And what I mean by that is that, and this is trying to phase in the questions I've asked you, because I sense the opportunities may be limited, that you want cooperating teachers. That's what you've stressed on page 289 to get the liberal arts moving. My worry is that without the discipline that I think is in your book, of a more specific curriculum, and perhaps a more disciplined curriculum, and perhaps a less free curriculum, we won't get the complete teachers that can educate to create the freedom that you want. I may be coming as a sort of voice from the past in the era of diversity and so on, but I feel that without acknowledging that structure, which I myself have experienced working with you, on the seminars in Carthage and New York and Chicago, that the disciplined approach to the arts is it in danger of being lost? And because I'm worried that that isn't in your book. It seems to be a very disciplined approach to the arts. What do you think about that? And you know, in order to create less illiberal outcomes, do we perhaps need a little less freedom in our curriculum?
Okay.
Scott, would you like to go for 3 minutes, or would you like to just break early and have a little bit more time to develop your answer after the break? Which would you prefer?
Why don't I start for 3 minutes and we'll see if we. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Because I'll lose it otherwise. Okay, so I think there's a discussion about, are the arts disciplines and are the disciplines arts? And I tend to want to concentrate on the arts and the sciences to try to get to that question. And I think when concentrating on the arts, if you're really looking at both what art is and how they are formulated and how then they are enacted through a techne and through achievements, discipline is a matter of in the sense that you're using it, is a matter of necessity. So then we get to freedom, and very quickly, and then we could probably take a break. Those seminars that we offered were never seminars they were never replicas of courses that happened at Columbia, Chicago, Dallas, Carthage. They never existed as courses. They existed as a seminar. And then when you went back, and all these other wonderful participants in the rejuvenating and renewing the liberal arts seminar went back, as well as the tradition and innovation, what you did was you went back and you made new courses using what the combination of your experience, your thought, your judgment, and what you had dealt with in the text and the conversations. So you made a new curriculum. I think that we find ourselves in a weird situation at ACTC often. I've talked to Charlie a little bit about this. So many people come to ACTC with this newly achieved curriculum. And they don't use ACTC to come when they're making the curriculum and thinking about it and inventing it, you know, and that's just a misapprehension. What they want to do is they want to present their curriculum. But I think the questions of freedom and discipline can be rolled into this question of beginning to make a curriculum. That's one approach. And I'll just let it go and we can finish it in a few remarks when we get back. When do you want us back, Charlie?
I want everybody back at 10:45, and my goodness, 10:30 on the dot. I'm pleased with us. At 10:45, we will reconvene. No reason to leave the room. Just turn off your mic, you turn off your camera if you like, or if you want to stay and just chat, unmute yourself and chat with each other. The space is ours, but we'll reconvene the formal session at 10:45, and we won't forget you, Phil. I'll make sure your question gets in there. Excellent. Welcome back, everyone, to the second half of our plenary panel on J. Scott Lee's invention, The Art of Liberal Education. We're going to start this second half off with remarks by Emma Cohen-Delara of University College Amsterdam. And then we already have several people on the queue, Philip Sloan, Richard Camber, Josh Perrins. And so, Scott, I imagine you'll want to reply directly to Emma, and then we'll move to Phil, and we can sort of, you can help me, decide how we want to handle each of the questions from there. And also, Mark Taylor asked a question shortly before or immediately before the break. So if we cut that off, I certainly don't want to marginalize those issues. So please let me know, Scott, if you'd like to continue to ask those, answer those questions, or Mark, if you'd like to follow up. We will make time for that. But right now, let me hand it off to Emma to get us started, and we'll we'll negotiate all those other concerns as we go. So Emma, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. And greetings from Amsterdam this time. And thank you also to Scott to invite me to say a few words. I've been involved with ACTC for around 7-8 years now, really with lots of pleasure. And Scott emailed me a copy of his book, Invention, the Art of Liberal Arts. And I wrote a shorter book review for our Association of University Colleges in the Netherlands. And initially I thought I would share the book review with you, and I will, and I'm actually going to put it in the chat right now for you to read at your leisure, because I thought, well, I can regurgitate the book review, and Scott already knows it, and we've already had many discussions about it. It's a very, for me, the book came at a really good time, I have to say. I think it really brings together Scott's ideas in an integrated way. And the book also came at a time where in the Netherlands, we, given the circumstances in the United States and the sort of the protest of the Black Lives Matter movement, that also had an effect in our country. And some effects were really good. I think they really created a space, or they really addressed certain issues that I think had been dormant for many, well, maybe for forever already. But at our college, I have to say, the effects were also negative. So there was also quite a bit of a backlash, and in the end, it's maybe not one-on-one, but our dean left. And so there was quite a bit of tension. And that also had an effect, I think, on the teachers and also on me personally, because it also affected, I think, there were some arguments that came up by people who associate the core with the canon. And that's also a lack of familiarity. But this was the context that I received Scott's book. And for me, it was extra important because I think Scott offers an argument for pluralism and for freedom that is an important argument, and that counters the association that some people have with core texts, that they would be read as authorities or so, and so forth. You probably know the argument, and I think there also more discussion is necessary also at our college, but Scott's book came at a really good time. I also think that Scott's book is a little bit like cheese. Forgive me for the Dutch metaphor, but it gets better with age. At least this is how it works with me. I've known Scott for years now, and so the book also came after knowing Scott for years already. And I noticed that I myself, and maybe in part because of Scott and because of his book, have also evolved as a teacher, in the sense that I have also become more open to pluralism in what I read with my students, and also more open in allowing my students more freedom, actually. And so that's my personal story. And in that light, I would actually like to share something with you that my students did in the current semester to my students, because, and I really think that this is a little bit, thanks to Scott, I offered them the opportunity to do a creative assignment. So to engage with certain text, in this case, a text by Aristotle and a text by Maimonides, a Jewish medieval thinker, and engage with them, with these texts in a creative way. And if it's okay, I want to share with you what these two students came up with. And it is a short choreography. It's only 2 minutes. So I'm going to show it to you. And just as a background, this is what they communicated also in writing. The first student, the tall student, embodies classical rationalism. And here she writes as an explanation of the choreography, movement incorporating the head emphasizes thinking and reasoning. The display of the hand and the counting movement stand for calculations, maths, sciences, examining, and yet essentially reasoning. The hands forming a crown portray humans' strive for power and their capability of exercising it. The display of the arms stresses the human capability to make their own decisions, solve problems, and to exercise power. The arms are able to pull the body up again after it's fallen down. Human beings can navigate themselves out of helpless situations and furthermore are able to save themselves. Rapid and reserved movement tries to underline the calculatable character of rationalism. So that's the first student. And then the second student, embodying revealed religion. I try through my movements to embody both love and fear of God, as if they became the same feeling. I want my choreography to be spontaneous, almost visceral. Moreover, I try to symbolize human beings as imperfect, fearful, confused at times. They cannot help but try to make sense of what surrounds them, despite their blindness, and attempt to walk in the way of the good people. That's a quote. I turn my face and twist my body to the point of exhaustion and incoherence. The disarticulation of my body represents the disconnection between the fleshy sheath and the mystery of my soul, as knowledge, power, and life belong to God only. I am only capable of creating incomplete human laws and cannot possibly question God's intent. I can only strive to achieve his morality and his justice. So here it goes. There was a bit about Martin Luther King in there as well, but didn't want to make it that long. So, and then I turned to Scott. Is this more or less, am I getting your spirit, so to speak? You're muted.
Yes, I'm so happy that you did this and that your students did it. I think the really significant, I have one question, and the really significant thing about this is because it's a recorded performance, you can watch it more than once. And it's rich enough, especially through indicators of the explanations. And this is really central to this. It's rich enough to go back and relook at it, okay? To think about what the students have actually accomplished here. And my only question would be, in their explanations, it's clear that they have reference to ideas that they find in the text. And I'm perfectly happy with the explanations that you read, which are actually a key to being able to move from their explanations to the actual choreography and performance, and then to move backwards. But I'm just curious about, you would have a confidence that they had drawn their ideas from the texts because you knew they read them and they knew they read them. It's kind of enthymematic in a sense, all right? But my question would be, did the explanations actually, did they actually refer to the text per se? And then a final question, or final statement. You see, this stuff is great because what can be constructed out of this is an electronic portfolio for the students, which they can then take and see, this is what my education did. This is what I'm capable of doing because of my education. And I think that's important as well.
Yeah, and I have to say, I read excerpts from the text that they submitted next to the choreography, and I just read small parts of it. So what they did is they also included actual references to Aristotle and Maimonides, and then also to King. And so you're actually right. I was also hesitant, but I thought let's go for it. Also in terms of I have to grade this, of course, and so how do you grade an assignment such as this? But I actually found several grading guidelines about creative assignments online. So, and my sense is also that these two students are obviously talented, and I've obviously I have not taught them to dance. I mean, they've obviously practiced this for years. So they're building on some of the talents that they have. And my sense, and this is also what I kind of mean by freedom, but maybe it's also my sort of free interpretation of what you say, is my sense is that this is also an assignment that will maybe probably stick longer with them than as if they would have written an essay. And then also the texts were, of course, from Aristotle and Maimonides. And in the past, I've sometimes really experienced difficulty of teaching classical or medieval texts to my students, given the environment we're in. And maybe they're difficult to all students, but AUC is a very, well, mainly a very progressive college. And so they, by definition, they generally like Rousseau and Marx. Those are their favorites. But then I remember teaching Augustine at one point, and they really, one student even asked me, "Are you religious?" So it's difficult. And so, you know, as we teach, not just, you know, in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of sort of emotional connection, you're also trying to establish an emotional connection with the text, between the text and the student, and the student and the teacher, and the teacher and the text.
You brought up right there at the end a very important part as well, which is that we're really in the business in part of cultivating some emotions, not just joy and learning, though I think that's the summative emotion. And Hume makes an argument in that direction, and many of you will be familiar with it. But I think we need a cultivation of emotion. We need it desperately. I used to teach Othello, and I would ask the question, can we talk about a larger emotion, larger and smaller emotions? And so I used pity and fear and went through the parts with my students to be able to talk about the size of an emotion, okay? So that's just a minor coda to what you did. Your achievement here is really stunning, Emma. and it exemplifies, I mean, seriously, not every students are, as you say, not all students are going to be as talented, but probably the more interesting thing is that they will bring different talents, whatever they do, even if they're kind of put on the frying pan of having to, well, now what do? I'm not an artist, I'm not a, singer, even if they're put in that position, they will marshal themselves and make some choices and selections, and that also goes to what these are about. Thank you. That was really neat. that was really, really neat.
All right, Phil Sloan, I believe you're up, and you're muted, so please unmute.
First, I want to thank you. It's been very good to see some old friends here and contacts. It's been some years since I've been in touch with many of you, and it's been great. First, I just wanted to make a comment on that, and maybe Emma can address this. This was actually generated by your talk, or your presentation was. You present this as two students in this sort of representing two different sides of you're using Aristotle and Maimonides, for example. One of them was sort of a religious view, one of them was sort of the rationalist. Yet you have a lot of points where they make contact with one another. They actually, at the end, and I don't know if there was some intent in that, some message that came through that was of interest there, that would be interesting to see if there was some reconciliation or harmony or there. That was the point there. But I had originally a question for Scott and a reaction. Maybe we can come back to your question, your point, Emma. Scott, after reading your book and our many conversations, which I was very impressed, it took me many years, even as president of ACTC, to quite understand where Scott was coming from. What were his roots? And I think this really helped me understand this, the importance of Aristotle's Poetics, which I had never quite appreciated, but which it becomes a very informative. And from your discussion, Scott, I found that very illuminating, and I found this a very, very helpful book. And I wish I had read it many years before myself. It would have changed some of my own thinking. But I have one question that's you might say a comment. And it really comes more from the philosopher in me, and also from the critiques by philosophers that I respect, people like Alistair MacIntyre, of our kind of program, a program of the great books, reading the great books and so forth. And this has to do with the sense of, first of all, the degree to which content does matter. So in other words, I think I'd be very resistant to thinking simply of a core arts. I think that's been too commonly a defense of the liberal arts. It teaches you critical thinking. It teaches you to question authority and so forth. But there's very little product in that other than developing a kind of sometimes rootless cosmopolitanism, we might say, in our students. But the other point is there within liberal arts education, and one which draws on a plurality of great texts that we might see, is there some sense that we could also speak of at least some question of a telos in this, that is trying to find something which I think is so deep in Aristotle, in Plato, in Descartes, in Augustine, in Kant, and so forth, and that is some kind of search for wisdom. That is that the arts help us to do this, but they aren't themselves sufficient in themselves to do this. That, in other words, that there's a dialectical quest that we might have that is seeking some kind of wisdom as a telos of our question in education. I think that's often the charge of some people against a program like ours, and it's what attracts people to alternative majors here at Notre Dame into things like philosophy, theology, etc., is the fact that they don't think that we really have enough concern with those questions. I'm not saying we don't, but I think it's a kind of question here I pose for you, Scott, is there beyond simply the notion of arts and invention, are you willing to at least consider the possibility of what I would say is a quest for something that goes beyond that, which is, you might say, wisdom itself, that might be some ways in which we try to articulate and order these things. I guess I've said enough on that point, but I think you know what I mean. We've had a couple of conversations about this.
And I think I can answer a little bit more. That's what continuing conversations are about. I think right before I get to that, I'm going to answer the business about content does matter. Now, and this kind of goes to Mark's questions. So I'll just, and we can get back to that, but I'll briefly say that I think there's a content to learning arts, and the liberal arts in particular, which I do think we've neglected. I also think my book tried to exemplify in speaking about Botticelli, the Aeneid, and the Poetics, about which touched on freedom, human enterprises, and a review of freedom, as well as the inventions that made these possible, okay? That there is clearly something about the human spirit that's involved here. I don't think there's any question about it. And I don't think, you know, right now there's an awful lot of work going on in, this may be a sidelight, but there's an awful lot of work going on, of course, on the evolution of humans and what began to separate them from our progenitors. And a lot of this really centers on a combination, it's not one thing, a combination of the maturation of the brain and sudden use of technologies that we didn't have before. And that starts with fire and cooking, you know? So I simply don't think that we can talk about ourselves without this kind of technological inventive conversation. It's just, you can't do it. And our own programs evidence that in every single book that we have. But, and we can get back more to Mark's question. So I think there's a content. Let's get to the wisdom business. I don't think our books can achieve wisdom. They can, for people. I don't think you are wise in 4 years because you have read these books. I do think a very serious and accessible, I mean, I do think that you can point to discussions about what wisdom is, continuing articulations by students. That's empirically even accessible. You can demonstrate it. And you can get into arguments with McIntyre about whether there's coherence here or not. I happen to think there is. I think it's a coherence that's actually far more rhetorical in the largest sense of the term, and is not necessarily simply concerned with the cultivation of virtue. It involves that, it can't do without it, but it is not solely directed by that, okay? In the way I'm thinking about it. On the other hand, I think you could say pretty reasonably that you can cultivate judgment, which is one intellectual virtue. And I think you can mark it out. I think you can mark stages. And the interesting thing about judgment is that there are sort of two forms of it. And we can elaborate this. But one involves understanding when you say you've read some statements and or heard some statements by people, and you're trying to judge their character, moreover, the kinds of things that practical wisdom is involved in. Okay, that's one kind of judgment. And then there's a judgment that you cultivate about what your learning is. And so we say, oh, finally, the student has understood that. And that kind of judgment, both on our parts and on a student's parts, is heavily involved. And you traffic back and forth between these two forms of judgment. And the larger and more capacious the program, the more this question of judgment arises, okay? And can become central. Now, we don't use it, and we have another core text, core liberal arts, core arts question. But judgment is actually, you know, we have students who don't want to judge others. Well, we want you to do it. I mean, just to be simple-minded for a second, we want you to cultivate your judgment. We want you to be proud of the achievement that you make in your judgment. We know that your judgment is going to be able to be taken out into the world and serve you well in either the arts and sciences or in ethics and politics. So yeah, I do think that you can take up questions of wisdom and make that part of acquiring judgment. I don't think we can make our students happy. We might be able to lay the groundwork for it, but I don't see how they could be happy without, it's not just instrumental, without learning how to invent in the largest sense that I'm talking about. I just don't see it. And I don't think that Aristotle in particular was particularly useful in arguing that wisdom in the arts is simply expertise. Okay, I think we could have gone a little bit further with that. And that's maybe goes to my much earlier remarks about Martha's, which you missed, unfortunately, and about to Matt in particular. So I don't know if that helps you to see why I think this project can be pluralistic, why it can involve both what I would call the political, ethical, and the inventive, and ought to. It's needful. But I do think it can be pretty successfully aimed at cultivating judgment. And that's the one character trait and the only character trait that I think we could honestly aim programs at and still retain our pluralism.
Let me just follow. Can I tell you just a quick one on that as a follow-up? I think I would agree with your point. I mean, it isn't the purpose of a curriculum to teach wisdom. I don't think I think you're quite right. That isn't a pedagogical goal. I think that, however, in the way in which we encounter questions that have been raised, both in the past and in the present, but that we can be led into a question of examining what are the really great questions that we might ask. Why am I here? What am I doing? What is the purpose of being human? That a curriculum like ours can inculcate. And I think that means something about reading the texts and authors from many different perspectives that in fact raise those questions for us. I mean, there's that one line in the play Shadowlands, put in the mouth of C.S. Lewis, when he's asked, why do we read these books? And he says, so that we'll know we're not alone. And I think that's an interesting point that sometimes students begin to appreciate and maybe realize at some point, is that so we'll know we're not alone in these questions and asking them. And I do think that gives us some way of thinking about what maybe some criteria about the kind of text that we tend to explore, even if we can have many different perspectives on it. But I've said enough, so I'll let you have any.
Well, I'll be brief because we all want to have a conversation here, or I'll try to be brief. I wouldn't deny any of those questions. I think some of the times they're answered through the arts and sciences. They're not answered in a metaphysical way. I think that to demand that they be answered in a metaphysical way or even a political way is to be insufficiently capacious. I do think, honestly, that what is art and what is science are equivalent to those questions. We aren't who we are without them, period. I just really think that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see how I don't see how we talk about ourselves without them. Further, I would say that, I would just say that I've tried to elaborate a character of liberal artists who have gone through our programs. I tried to elaborate that in, I think it's the first chapter. What you would, if you concentrate not on becoming a certain person in the discipline, but what would you be like if you had an education that would suit this. And one of the many attributes, I think, which again, I think are in some ways accessible. And the only reason I mention assessing is as being able to provide evidence to people to be able to talk about, okay, these programs. Something like Emma just did. I think that one of the most important thing about the arts is they lead us to and involve us in communities. You know, maybe others think that the Association for Cortex and Courses is a political organization. We tried to steer away from the most obvious aspects of that. We certainly do wish to achieve things in education, but I think what we are is kind of an artistic, liberal arts organization, and we've been led to community precisely because of that. We would never have achieved what we did achieve if we didn't have these conversations. Otherwise, if we think it's just valuable as kind of a relax, you know, it's a break from our day to day and so forth and so on, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it, but that's not the relaxation that, say, I think Aristotle, by the way, does a nice job of this that he's talking about in the politics. Okay, it's more scholae. So I don't know if that gets to what you were saying. I hope it does.
Rick is next on the queue. Let me just sort of jump in, not to ask a question, Scott, but to recommend to all of you to go back and have a look at the recording of Marsara Shukla's plenary from Wednesday. I don't remember off the top of my head whether it's posted yet, but if it's not up yet, it will be. And she went to Emily Dickinson's poetry to think about how books and poetry and Emily Dickinson in particular, and these images of entombment, even more specifically, operated as consolation. But the reason I think it's relevant right now is that when we talk about an education for judgment, or an education that what we can educate students in, education that takes emotions into consideration, I think the kind of conversation that she prompted and that we had around her talk is very relevant to this. And so far as these things, and of course, lots of different texts do this in different ways, but in a very intense way, the way that Dickinson is provoking certain strong emotional embodied responses from us, and then having that be a part of what we work on together in the classroom. It's not precisely the same as what we're talking about here, but I think it's relevant enough that I think you would all find that helpful and interesting. But Rick, you're next.
Yeah, I have a specific question about something you say, Scott, in your lovely chapter on the irreducible case of Liza Doolittle. But I want to preface that with a more general question, and that really has to do with the desirability of using Shaw's plays as cortex. I myself am extremely fond of Shaw's plays and his writing. I think that's brilliant, and I'm often surprised that he doesn't get staged more often. And I'm also surprised that he doesn't turn up more often at ACTC meetings. So that's the broad question. The more specific question has to do with a particular comment that you make. And that comment is, you say it is not the power of liberal education to make even ethically right people, but rather for it to offer people the choices and opportunities to make themselves. Now, I mean, of course, Pygmalion is a play about transformative education. And we've been talking throughout this conference, and certainly in the session, about transformative education and how to utilize the powers of the arts to make that happen. So I'm kind of fascinated by this specific remark that you make, that the power we're talking about is not to make people ethically right, but rather to offer people the choices and opportunities to make themselves.
Well, Rick, I want to thank you for picking up on that particular question, and I'll explain why I want to thank you in a minute or two. Let's go back to your first question, which was, obviously, by throwing Pygmalion out there, I was saying, hey, folks, here's a candidate for being included in a Cortex program. You might want to think about it. But the particular reason for throwing it out there is because it is so centrally involved in making students, well, making people reflect on the very nature of an education. It's certainly aimed at independence or freedom at the end. It's somewhat accidental in a comic way, but also it's one of the few documents on education which successfully takes the point of view of the student and not the professor. And that, to me, is one of its hugest virtues. If what you want to do, instead of trying to inculcate people by making inculcating students how we think about it, this text at least takes the student's point of view of this thing. And not only does it take the student's point of view in an utterly wonderful and captivating way, but it really does speak to our limits, I think. And that's how we get to our, and that gets to our second question. And one of I developed this paper long time ago. Much of it came out of my original dissertation work, but then kept thinking about it. And part of that ending is a result of the Euro conference in Navarra, in which a number of people were making the argument that what we could do is we could assess for phronesis. We could cultivate phronesis, which is this subsumptive intellectual function. It takes in everything. We could cultivate phronesis, and then we could assess for it. And not only did this begin to sound an awful lot like expertise, okay, not just our own, but that what we're doing is we're matching up expertise. Goes back to Phil's question a little bit. We're matching up expertise. And what we're going to throw up here is phronesis and prove that we can do it with our students. But what it seemed to ignore, because phronesis is subsumptive, is it seemed to ignore all the rest of the character traits that our students bring and their ambitions and purposes. Now, that's why I think, and by the way, I think the play rests in judgment, frankly. But that's why both the comedy of it and some of the outcomes of it. That's why I think judgment is a better intellectual function. And I think judgment goes to the questions of opportunity, choice, and self-making. Okay, so I think now I can elaborate a little bit. I won't go on this, but I will just reiterate or elaborate a little bit of my remarks that then imply what we would do with a curriculum if it's true that we take judgment as something we're aiming at. First off, of course, I think judgment, it's going to involve freedom, and I think I can say why. It's going to involve a certain amount of artfulness. I think I can say why. It has ethical and, let's call it professional, disciplinary implications, arts and sciences implications. So again, if you say to yourself, well, one thing we want people in our program to do is to understand, what it is that people are saying about anything as broad as some of the things Phil brought up, happiness, the ends of life, the purpose of life, or anything that I added in about what is art or science and so forth. if we want them to understand that, well, there are somewhat, they all fall in some way, because we're a cortex program, they all fall into the notion of statements. Okay, now they can be further elaborated by simply at first saying, well, don't we also judge works of art, painting? Don't we also judge if an experiment's going to work? Don't we also judge if this theory was adequate? Scientific theory was adequate, a mathematical theory was adequate. We can get to that, but the judgment, the notion of judgment is different because as one launches off into the form and functions of arts and sciences, that's a different kind of understanding. You're using it to learn, whereas the other, you're saying, well, okay, perhaps we'll go this far. I think it's fair to say, what am I to become in light of these statements by wise people, or statements that are considered over a whole period of time? These two forms of judgment interact in human life. You can't really just separate them. You have to be able to go back and forth and be able to discriminate them is a pretty good thing, and I think we can do that. In fact, they involve discrimination by students. That's one of the chief ways in which we could build an assessment, is talking about how well students come to discriminate, and then what they do in terms of consideration to reach an understanding and to judge where to go forward. That's also why it's important to have, say, artistic products at the end here as capstones of courses. I think that's a really good reason for that. So what that implies is that the larger your curriculum, the more capacious it can be, and not everybody can be, but the larger it is, the more capacious of arts and sciences, including political science and ethics, including poetry and physics, if you wish. The larger it can be, the wider is the range for freedom. That's what it implies. It also implies that then students are in the position, not everybody comes, to our programs wanting to be ethically trained. They've already got a character that came out of their neighborhood, their family, their nation, and so forth. They've got that, they possess it already. It also opens it up to students who might want to see their judgment moving out of ethics into art or science, or back into ethics. So the range of freedom is important, and then what you have a choice, and then you're making yourself, or ethically cultivating yourself through the selections you make of texts and interests. Okay, some texts catch people, and we know this. Students perform differently with different texts. It's really interesting. And it's something that should be captured and cultivated. So I think students can help to make themselves, if we present them this range, that's one sense of choice. And another is the sense of choice of having to develop and use the arts in order to produce something out of their understanding. That's the answer I can give right now.
Well, that's a great answer, Scott. It's very insightful, very provocative. But come back for just one moment to the question of using Shaw's plays as cortex.
Oh, well, okay. One time I was interviewed for a position that I didn't get, thankfully, because then, ultimately I ended up at ACTC. I was second place. And the question came up. I was sort of prepared at the time, not quite, to defend Shaw as possibly a greater comedic artist than Shakespeare. I don't know if I don't know. I certainly have forgotten most of the arguments. I will say that I might make. It'd be worth my while to revive them, but I haven't got the time right now to do it. Maybe I'll do it maybe I do have the time. Anyway, I do think that the power of Shaw's comedy rests partly with his playfulness with form, and partly with the depth of the seriousness that he mocks and the depth of the seriousness that accomplishes the comedy makes that which seems so serious absurd. So Higgins' professionalism, yeah, you know, pretty much from when I'll make a duchess of this draggle-tailed gutter snipe, you know, at that point he's crossed over the line, but it's because he takes his discipline so seriously that he substitutes a draggle-tailed gutter snipe, an experiment, for who Liza actually is. Okay, and she does the same thing. Oh, sure, I want to be I'd like to be a flower girl. That's really what I'd like to do. I'd like to have a little job, you know, that's why I'm here. Okay, so all she did was go to her institution, her local institution, Higgins, and got an education, right? And so I think that Shaw's capacity for this view, this long-range view, this depth of comedy makes him a candidate. And there's the second play that, of course, is even harder, I think, for students and faculty, is Saint John, which has been criticized as the perfect tragedy, which in fact was ruined by this comic ending. I don't think that. I think he's right about the comic ending. But there again, as he says, you know, the gods laugh at the saints weep for their murder. The gods laugh at the murderers. That's a cosmic view of the order of what Martha was talking about. And that's rarely achieved. Most of our comedies are, you know, I'm fine with them. Shaw wrote some of them, are slapstick, or most of them are pretty reductive of the capacity of human beings. Not Shaw's. Shaw is wide open to the capacities of human beings. And that's what marks the difference, by the way, the transformation from him as a polemicist to a dramatist meant that he had to undertake a far wider view of what humans could be than he had in his polemic treatises.
Thank you, Scott. I have, well, I don't want to take any more time because everybody wants to be part of this conversation. Though the thought occurs to me that one of Shaw's virtues is his capacity to find just the right word in the right sentence. If indeed, I think maybe Martha made this point about Emily Dickinson, that this amazing ability to make language work with a precision that we seldom see, but I think is highly instructive for students.
The whole third act.
That question, if you wish, so we can pass on to other things, but I can't resist calling attention to that virtue.
You're absolutely
let's
right.
get
The third act has it in. They done the old woman in. There you go.
Let's get Josh in on this. Josh, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'd like to put this in 2 steps. So in the first step, I'd like you simply to confirm whether I've gotten your argument right. And then I'd like to raise some issues about it. So the argument that I'm interested in is chapter 7, sections 2 and 3. Those of you who heard my plenary will see that I in a way in my plenary tried to set up the question that I'm going to ask now. So the question I have, so not yet the question, but the argument that you make is a response to Bruce Kimball's assessment of the relationship between the artes liberales, I'll refer to it as the liberal arts, the citizenship-oriented use of the liberal arts on the one hand, and the liberal free ideal that is characteristic of the research university. So Kimball is not sanguine. He thinks the liberal free ideal is likely to win out and that there isn't much of a future in the liberal arts citizenship-oriented approach. Your response to him is that invention, which is exemplified in the liberal arts citizenship-oriented use of the liberal arts. Invention exemplifies the liberal arts. And you believe that if there is a piecing together or a sewing together of these two aspects of the university, right, the liberal arts part and the liberal free ideal, or let's just call it the research university, the thing that will tie them together is invention. So have I gotten that just as the basic argument correct?
Fundamentally, any modifications won't matter. I mean,
okay.
That's
okay.
You know, I will make some, but they won't matter.
Okay, that's fine. Now, a way in which you characterize this opposition is to refer to the heart of the liberal arts as invention. The heart of the research model is hypothesis. You'll recall from Rejuvenating and Reinventing that if you were to ask me, I probably would characterize the opposition as the opposition between the syllogism on the one hand and that which thinkers like Bacon are attempting to put in the place of the syllogism, at least in some domains. Of course, the term that he uses for that is induction. Descartes follows with a term that I think ultimately is really pointing to the same basic idea, which is analysis. But they both engage in a very intense attack on the syllogism. So I just want to put all that to a side. It starts to get a little, I'm not going to talk about analysis or induction. Instead, I want to reframe it with reference to the trivium and the quadrivium. If the syllogism has its life in the trivium, and the trivium are the arts of speech, and the quadrivium are the arts of number. One way of restating the opposition between the liberal arts and the research university is to say that when Bacon and Descartes attacked the syllogism, what they did was to establish a novel approach to the arts of number that in an important way severed the connection between what had been the trivium and what is now the quadrivium. Now, if the replacement for the quadrivium is essentially what the research university is, and it's based on new arts of number, and a new understanding actually of what number does, what it points to, what it enables us to know. My question is what within the resources of the trivium, assuming that for you, invention is of the very essence of the trivium, what within the trivium really enables us to bridge the gap between what we now refer to as, say, humanities and STEM? It seems to me that in a way what you're arguing is that invention is the thing that can bridge the gap between the humanities and STEM. So that's yet another way. I mean, there are all sorts of oppositions. I may be lining up too many, but I think roughly speaking, I haven't really distorted too much in the things that I've lined up. But so if I restate your hypothesis that way, do you see some of the challenge?
Yes.
Or just what's your thought? What's your response?
Yes. Okay, so I probably then will modify what you said. It would be better that you said what you said and that you got out what you said, right? So then I will modify it in light of my understanding both of Bruce Kimball and my own argument. Okay. I think that invention is the characteristic response of the arts, and that includes the trivium, but extends far beyond the trivium. I think that all of the books that we could read, not that we necessarily can read because of size of curriculum, but all of the books that we could read, including those of the sciences and the development of mathematics and concepts of number, less the teaching of it, okay, are in fact inventions. I've tried to explain the grounds for this, but basically, you know, they come into existence. They didn't exist before. People didn't think like this. I had a conversation with Martha Franks about how in the two new sciences, pretty much at the outset of the two new sciences, Galileo runs up to getting very close to the calculus, but doesn't go there. It takes Newton and Spinoza. So if that issue of invention then turns the sciences, in a sense, into the arts, and that provides, in thinking about it, I think, one way to get across the bridge. I mean, that's the most universal way, and I want to put this differently. The argument that you well adduced in the out of that section. And by the way, I had a long talk. I want to say this. I had a long talk with Martha and Phil about the inclusion of this chapter, and I couldn't have written this book without the inclusion of that chapter. And I had to go back and revise it and rethink it in order to be able to get it in there in a coherent way. If you ask me what was one of the distinctions between that was made by people like Bacon and Descartes and analysis and conception of number, what was the consequence? Well, consequence or simultaneous development was the distinction between the humanities and the sciences. And yes, I do think that the sciences proceed by hypothesis. I think they do. I think the humanities, insofar as they're artful, proceed by invention. The question is whether you're going to have in the humanities a broad view of knowledge, or whether you're going to ape or emulate the sciences in their ultimate outcome of disciplinary formation. Okay, so if it's true that inventions are characteristic of our entire curriculum across the arts and sciences, then they can be examined, and the trivium comes to aid here. Our Bridging the Gap project would have been an example of this, that went over 3 years, over arts and sciences simultaneously at the same time. And in particular, dialectic is useful for this. I'm less concerned with the Platonic dialectic that wants to proceed to a synthesis of arts and sciences, as I am to a more Aristotelian or possibly Ciceronian dialectic, which is concerned with what are the fundamentals of a science? How does it get started? What is it based on? If we think this is fundamental to what we know, then what do we know? What are we saying we know? What do we have there? The trivium still works in this way, in a very real sense, whatever the advances are. I do think, of course, that the implication of what I'm saying is you have to pay some attention to number. I mean, you have to pay attention to what became the severed, what you characterize as the severed arts of number from the unity of the trivium and quadrivium. I'm more I'll respond this way. It's not very helpful, but I think it's true. I do think that in working across the aisle with mathematicians and scientists, if it's possible, and this gets really difficult within the institutional context, it would be possible to bring something like a consideration of what the very nature of number is to the fore. That's the same kind of thing as asking, what is an art? What the nature of numbers is one of those essential questions. And that does lead to having to think about the development of mathematics over time. It just does. How we induce people into that is an entirely different question, and one that maybe I wouldn't even be prepared to answer. I will say though that it takes time. So I'm not sure I'm entirely answering your question, but I will then one or two more steps recur to some points in them. I took exception to Bruce's argument, not only on the question of whether the liberal arts are necessarily tied to a certainty embodied in text, which is expressed through language, versus a skepticism of any old truths, which are then attacked and reformulated by hypothesis. I didn't take exception to that characterization, but I took exception to the notion that, I took exception to the notion that the liberal arts function was in this way tied, not that it doesn't appear, but that it was only tied that way. And he argues that projects such as St. John's, Chicago, Yale, Columbia, et cetera, just ticking them off, are inherently unstable. I thought that the question of invention of new arts and sciences went all the way back to using the older arts and sciences to develop new arts and sciences. And that's why I think you and I had a disagreement about this, and that's fine. And I learned a great deal about your discussion about the attack on the syllogism. Okay, I learned from that a great deal. It's serious. But I do think that actually Bacon was using rhetoric to establish the very methodology that he wanted to achieve in the sciences. And that shifted the end of invention that made invention the end of the sciences, as opposed to a means that it was in Cicero. The end in Cicero is eloquence or persuasion. Invention is a means. It's a way of discovering arguments and judgments and things to talk about. In Bacon, invention is an end. That's where you're headed. And I think we can learn something from that. It might not make us into scientists, but I do think we should take it very seriously, and I think it's apropos for our own works in the arts and sciences, in ethics, and so forth. And I've explained why.
Scott, I just have to note here that we have less than 10 minutes left, and Dan is still on the queue. Sorry to not open up for follow-up, Josh, but maybe there'll still be a minute for that. But Dan, why don't you have the last hand up, and why don't you ask your question, and then we'll let the last 10 minutes of our session play out however we like.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Dan van Schalkwijk. I'm quite new to ACTC. I've attended some time ago when the conference was in Amsterdam, but this time Emma has actually invited me to join, and I have to say this has been one of the most enjoyable weeks in my life. I've had great conversations with people, and I'm really happy about the conference so far. So thank you very much for that. I'm a biologist by training, and I teach courses in health at Amsterdam University College, interdisciplinary courses. I'm a big fan of using invention in my courses. I always end with a creative project for my students where they can freely express, and I find it's very, very instructive. It's very big learning experience for them. So I fully I appreciate the importance of invention that you are emphasizing. I also have to say that I haven't yet read your book, but I'm really triggered to read it after the session. As I seem to be the last question asker, I have a question which is actually more of an invitation to a follow-up discussion, because I was very triggered by the question of Philip earlier about the connection between invention and wisdom. Later on today, we'll have a session about a course that we're trying to develop, and that we're actually hoping to get help from you. As you earlier suggested, this is a great place to get help. Well, we need a bit of help, and we appreciate help. Which is about the philosopher Leonardo Polo, and we think he has some creative insights. I actually think that in his philosophy there's a clear link between wisdom and creativity. He says that the habit of wisdom is the habit through which we get to know ourselves as persons. And that also means our personal relationships, both at a transcendental and at a human level. And creativity is an expression of ourselves as persons. There's a certain newness in us as persons that we express through our creativity. So in that way, wisdom and creative expression are intimately linked. Well, again, I haven't read your book yet, but I think this is more of an invitation to maybe continue to see whether this line of reasoning could be a philosophical foundation for your further philosophical foundation for your proposal.
Oh, wow, thank you. First thing, be assured we'll get you a copy. I think I would be very interested in that kind of discussion for obvious reasons. I think it's a good discussion to have. I think people could even have, topically recur to the discussion. I happen to prefer the term invention a bit more than creativity, because I think it's ultimately a richer term. It has a longer history and it goes over much of the ground that creativity is just trying to, as it were, absorb. I will say one thing that is, and I'll be short about this. One of the things that I didn't do too much, well, no, two things, I'm sorry. Again, if you look at the character outline in the first chapter of what a liberal artist could look like, you'll see this communal way of that we learn about ourselves business showing up in that description of what the character might be. But I'm hesitant to use the word expression because of the argument that really when you're trying to make something or complete something, what you're concentrating on is the potentials that are in front of your materials, right? And with the materials and the potentials of your invention and so forth, some of which won't be known, or then there are the surprises that just plain happen as you go through this, none of which was necessarily intended. It happens. Some of it is, experimentally more often, this is very intentional. Artistically, maybe not, maybe a little bit wider range. But I would say that the way in which you know yourself somehow comes through by dealing with the very nature of the thing you're trying to create. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know these materials work this way. That kind of thing. Again, perhaps not as often the case, but there are arguments in the literature about invention and engineering where surprises happen all the time, and certainly consequences afterwards. But that's for another discussion. Thank you for that. Thank you so much. And good luck.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes left, not very many, 4, 3.5, something like that. And the queue is open.
So I'll take the opportunity to follow up.
Yeah.
So that modern science ends in invention, or as Aristotle would put it, in production. Scott all of a sudden went away from my screen.
Yeah,
that's a
that's
little.
maybe he wasn't open to your follow-up. I don't imagine that's the case. I imagine he's panicking right now.
Yeah, there isn't much point in my speaking.
Let's give him just a second to find his way back, because I know that's what he's trying to do.
Josh, while we're waiting, explain a little more about the criticism of syllogism in Bacon and Descartes. This is wonderful stuff.
Yeah, so it really goes back to a decision, and here many people will disagree with me, but I believe that the motive really has to do with human life and human affairs. That is what drives him in the direction, his turn to induction, is the need to renounce the search for first causes. His motive for that is given by Machiavelli. And the attack on the syllogism is of a piece with this general abandonment of the pre-modern search for the first causes or the highest causes. So having made what was in effect a political decision to renounce that search, one has to develop a new kind of an approach to knowledge. And the way in which he casts it is that rather than using syllogisms to rise to the first causes of things, one needs instead to search for the things that are most common across all different kinds of beings. And the way to discover those is not to search for first causes, but instead to what he calls for middle axioms. So middle axioms are what we come to call laws of nature. Laws of nature are not necessarily formulated yet in Bacon in terms of number fully. However, his renunciation of any notion of form, his reference only to materiality, means, I think, in the end, that it's pretty inevitable that a pivot will be made toward number, and number used in a completely different way. One way of thinking about this is if we go back to Aristotle and the way in which he uses the syllogism and the way in which he develops his sciences, he uses mathematics as the paradigm of what it would mean to have certain knowledge of things. However, he doesn't use math in his sciences. It's a model for reasoning, but he doesn't use number himself in his sciences. So that turn away from first causes toward what we come to call laws of nature, you can see how the writing is on the wall for what will come to be laws of nature as moderns talk about them, which have very little relation to the way in which Aristotle talked about nature. So anyway,
ACTC, the only professional association on the planet where we kill time to overcome technical difficulties by talking about the loss of the syllogism and the transition from ancient to modern mathematics.
I'm so sorry about that. That was my fault.
No, yeah, it's fine, Scott. That was a lovely moment. Thank you very much, Josh. Why don't we just stretch for 4 minutes to make up for lost time? We'll end it at 12:05, but we probably should end there. Scott, where would you like to? We only have a few minutes. How would you like to close us out?
I'd like to hold off on responding to Josh further. I think what I want to do is to take the time to say how really honored I've been by this this 3 hours. It's very few people, well, other people do, but I don't have this happen to me ever. And so I'm just really honored. I worked with all of you out there, almost all of you, and it was the experience of a lifetime. And I simply am so humbled by this. You've given me both things to think about going into the future, but things to remember about the past, which are really dear to me. And so I'll just close by saying that.
And we, we have a minute for others if they'd like to chime in, but as someone who only very recently stepped in your shoes, I'm here to say what everybody knows, and that they're giant, and I'm going to do my best for this association. But we are all so deeply in your debt for founding this organization, for developing it, for nurturing all the relationships, because what is an association but relationships among people? And so thank you so much.
It was a pleasure, every moment of it. Okay, well, thank you all. Charlie, you want to close it out?
Yeah, sure. We're the conference is on break for a few minutes, but we're ending strong. We have 5 concurrent sessions at 1 o'clock, and Dan has asked for our help in one of them. So if you don't already have plans, maybe go see if you can give the Amsterdam University College folks a hand. Business meeting is this afternoon at 2:45. If you're interested, very casual affair, but we'll make some announcements and open the floor for suggestions about future activities. And I'd love to see you there. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Scott.
All right, bye-bye.